Welcome, everybody. I'm so happy you're all here in person in the gathering space. What a beautiful space this is, and just a wonderful event. My name is Dr. Elizabeth Russell. I'm the director of the Trent Center for Aging and Society, and this is just such a special moment. Just for me personally, I've been in this position for 2 years, and to be doing things in person again. So we haven't done this for 2 years. It's just like, it feels brand new, even though it's not. And I'm just reflecting on being at Trent for 6 years now, and I'm looking out into these faces. I remember coming to things like this and thinking, I don't know anybody. How am I going to fit in here? And I'm looking out, and I feel like I know so many of your faces here, like students and faculty and staff, and it's just such a warm, wonderful environment that Trent is. So I'm just so happy you're here, and we're so thrilled to be hosting this wonderful scholar, our first international scholar for this special program. So just a really special night tonight, and just happy to be here. So first, I would like to introduce David Newhouse. Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, thank you.
We are recording this. Would you mind just popping that on?
Okay.
Just a
Okay. Now, every course evaluation for the last 30 years has said, speak louder. So they give me this microphone these days. But thank you for coming. I do want to welcome you to the traditional territory of the Mississauga Anishinaabe. This is their traditional territory, and they've lived on this land for millennia. It's also land that is covered by a series of agreements. It's covered by the dish with one spoon agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe, and that agreement has been in place now for a few hundred years. It's also covered by treaties with newcomers, the treaty with the English, the Treaty 20 of 1818, and also most recently the Williams Treaties of 1923. All of those treaties, all those agreements are agreements for us to share the land and to share the bounty from the land and to live well together. And that has been a bit of a challenge at times, as you know from history, but we're always optimistic, we're always hopeful that we'll get it right sometime, but I think most recently reconciliation is helping us to move in that direction. I thought before we start, I thought I'd also want to share a couple things about this room. This room is part of the NYN building. The building that you see around you is called NYN. NYN means the way we speak together in Anishinaabe. And the building hosts the First Peoples House of Learning, the Chani Wenjak School, the Department of Economics, the Trent School of Business, the Math Department, and the Research Office. So it hosts a whole variety of buildings, and it also hosts Zosky College. People often confuse buildings with other entities and with colleges, and that's been the tradition at Trent. And that's not this building, right? The Zosky is inside the building. All the other entities are part of the building as well. And what we have is a First Peoples House. The elements of the First Peoples House are distributed throughout the building. There's this room here, which is the Ernest and Benedict gathering space. There's also Nozam Theater. There's also a lecture theater down the hallway. There's the atrium. All of the First Peoples elements are red, including the elevator. And people always ask us, can they use it? And I can say yes, that you don't have to be Indigenous to use the elevator, right, as well. So it's there. And so the elements of the First Peoples House are purposely distributed throughout the building because we wanted people to understand that Indigenous people are everywhere in this country, that we're not just confined to one small space. And so as you work your way through the building, you'll see elements of indigeneity everywhere. And they're not the iconic versions. We try to ensure that they're also updated, that they reflect a contemporary presence as well. And you'll see Indigenous art of contemporary artists located throughout the building as well. This room itself is in the shape of a Anishinaabe lodge, and it's covered with weathered steel to honor the Mohawk steel workers in this area. So that's the red covering of it as well. And on the floor, there's also a medicine circle, right, that is used for teaching. So there are elements of indigeneity that are built entirely through this building. The building itself is colored using the medicine circle colors. Right? You'll see yellow representing the dawn of the new day, and it colors the walls of the residence. And the students represented the new day. Right below it are where the big windows are. It's colored in white, and white represents wisdom, and that's where all the faculty are. I'm not sure whether we're wise or not, okay, as well. And then you'll see black and red as well. Our instructions to the architect was to build a building that sits gently on the land. And I think they succeeded because we now have a 6-story building that sits gently on the land. It doesn't look like a 6-story building, right, as well. So, and we also wanted to make sure that we had lots of light. So there are windows everywhere, and if you come in here in the evening, you'll see that it glows as well. What I like about the building is that it glows in the dark. Right? So if you're outside, you can see the building from a distance as well. So it's a beacon, right, as well. It was situated right across from the library to represent another site of learning on the land. Right? The library represents a European style of learning from scholarship, learning from books, and this building is to represent learning on the land. So there's a story right here that we tell all the time about the building. And since storytelling is part of our tradition, we try to ensure that we tell the story as often as we can as well. So I do want to then welcome you to NYN, welcome you to the traditional territories of the Mississauga Anishinaabe, and welcome to Trent. And I'm looking forward to the talk this evening. Okay, so thank you.
Thanks, David. We're so happy of our growing partnership and relationship with Channing Wenja School. So thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us tonight. we're going to show this video about the program, the Katz program. So yeah, hope you enjoy it.
The Trent Center for Aging and Society is absolutely thrilled to be honoring Stephen Katz, Emeritus Professor of Sociology at Trent University. After his 30-year career and really his pioneering visionary role in leading interdisciplinary aging studies and critical gerontology internationally, his fingerprints are all over aging studies at Trent University. And whether you're an undergraduate student, a graduate student, a junior faculty member, or a community member just interested in what Trent's doing in regards to aging, Stephen's influence is everywhere. And so we're quite thrilled to be honoring him with this Visiting Scholar program.
The scholarship is going to bring a very, very important person to Trent, not only to speak, but to be visible, to represent what is great about Trent's interdisciplinary traditions and what is new about Trent in terms of advancing aging research.
My name is Megan Leonard, and I am part of Trent University's class of 2015 and one of Professor Stephen Katz's former students. I wholeheartedly believe that the Stephen Katz Distinguished Visiting Scholars Program should be supported simply because of who Professor Katz is as a person. Professor Katz has always believed in me and in the merits of my research, from his initial suggestion that I write an honors thesis in 2014 until the very end of my study, and for this I am truly grateful. Now, as I begin my career as an elementary school teacher, I hope to have the same positive impact on my own students someday as Professor Katz has had on me.
That's, of course, a very, very big privilege for me, as I'm very happy and proud. My name linked with that program and Stephen Katz, that's really a big thing for me. So for me personally, that means a big career thing too. So I'll put it on my CV, and it's important for me as a scholar, as an aging studies scholar, because Stephen Katz is a household name in the field. What it does also is it puts Trent on the map, it puts the center on the map, and it also links our center in Graz to Trent University, and it makes visible the connections that are there between universities. So it's really an international program, and it's great to have that program here.
I'm very proud also to say that my family has agreed to launch an initial and substantial pledge to invest in this program. My father himself, who's 94, and who appreciates not only what it means to age, but how he himself has been cared for through compassion and through critical and radical approaches to his own old age, is more than happy to begin launching a financial investment and pledge in this program that will be matched by other members of my family.
Trent's fortunate to be located in a community that has always been so generous in supporting its missions and supporting its goals. This is important for us as a community, and I live in this community too. It's important for us as a community because we are an aging community. We're one of the, in terms of age profiles, we're one of the oldest communities in Canada. We want to be an age-friendly community. We want to make this a community that is going to be good to grow old in. We also want to provide, I think, opportunities for the community also to come and hear really exciting and stimulating ideas. People of any age to come and hear those ideas. So, I mean, for all of these reasons, it's just so important to support initiatives like this. And I know I'll personally be supporting it. It fits Trent, it fits Peterborough, and is absolutely worthy of support.
The important thing to note about this this program is it's not just the talk, it's everything surrounding the talk. It was very important that we include students and really find ways to integrate this visiting scholar into our community here at Trent for a couple of days and find ways to make it special for them and for everyone to have the chance to interact with that person and learn from them in really nice, special, informal ways as well. So I had the pleasure, Amber and I had the pleasure of speaking with Sandy at dinner last night. That's sort of like one of the perks of the job is meeting lovely people in these informal settings. So we got to know Sandy a little bit, and you had some sessions around Trent today, talking to some students and everybody here. So that's really at the core of this program. And yeah, it's just something that's been a real generous, many donors have contributed to this over the years, and we recently had some funds given from the Dean's Enhancement Fund, so that's something that I know Advancement is now working on a potential for matching as well. So that's just a wonderful opportunity to continue growing this program for many decades of bringing scholars that are maybe local, maybe international, yeah, so, and I just wanted to say hi to Beth from Advancement. If you had any questions about the program, she's here, and I was chatting with her, and I think she's really excited to hear about the talk as well. So it's just something really, I think, lovely about Trent is, we have different reasons for coming to these spaces, but at the end of the day, we're all really just interested in the culture of, learning about pushing back against sort of the stereotypes of aging, and how can we as a community think differently about aging. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Katz, the man.
There. Does that work?
Oh, what do you know? Thank you, Elizabeth, and David. And also to remind people that, yes, this program is funded totally through philanthropy and donations, and if anyone's interested in learning more or following up with, then Beth is here from our advancement office, and please maybe after the talk, talk to her about it. So, welcome to the Trent Center for Aging and Society's fourth visitor and speaker in our Stephen Katz Lecture and Interdisciplinary Aging Studies program. Usually I do not introduce our visitors in a program named for me, in my own honor. But in this case, the honor really is all mine, because this is a very special evening. Not only because, as Elizabeth said, because this evening returns us to the program after a hiatus of 2 years, but most importantly because our guest is Professor Sandy Grande. I have not done this alone tonight. I also want to thank Amber Kolobaba and Elizabeth and everybody at the center, Mark Skinner, of course, who has really helped collectively organize this and work very, very hard behind the scenes. Sandy is a professor of political science and Native American and Indigenous Studies at the University of Connecticut. And we are very grateful she has agreed to travel from Storrs, Connecticut, involving several ways and means of transportation. I guess there was road transportation, air transportation, I don't know what other transportation in there, but thank you for putting all those together to come to us to be here at Trent. Her accomplishments are many, including recently being awarded a Ford Foundation Senior Fellowship in 2019 and 2020. There's only 2 of these awarded nationally per year in the United States. For her work on Indigenous elders and aging, that we'll hear more about tonight. Her advocacy is also well known. For example, she's a founding member of New York Stands for Standing Rock, as is her very provocative book, Red Pedagogy, Native American Social and Political Thought, published in 2004 and recently published in a 10th anniversary in 2015. It's kind of 11 years, but anyway, it is 10th. If you don't know this book, by the way, it's a really creatively organized set of dialogues about resistance to American ideologies that are embedded in the educational field, that have abetted the violence against Indigenous peoples, their lands, and their spaces of life. As with all her work, it's a vision for radical change and social justice. I myself came across Sandy's work through reading her remarkable article, Aging Precarity and the Struggle for Indigenous Elsewheres, in the International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education. One of the benefits of studying a long time in aging studies is once in a while you come across an absolutely brilliant piece of work, which this was. I assigned it immediately in my graduate course on aging because it is such a deep and clear and beautifully written articulation of the relationship between ageism and colonialism, on how settler logics of domination and disposition and racism are mobilized through capitalist logics of austerity and neoliberalism that dismiss older Indigenous peoples themselves as if they're biopolitical problems of burden and crisis and risk and unproductivity. It should be on the reading list of every course in gerontology. Sandy's working on a new book about which she'll have more to say, Indigenous Elders and the Elsewhere of Aging, but I anticipate it to be a game changer, promising to lay bare those universalizing colonialist models of memory and personhood and dementia and elder care and life course, against which she offers new elsewheres of Indigenous resilient mutuality, intergenerational care, and communal heritage that, in her words, might deliver us from the capitalist race to nowhere. Sandy's elsewheres are alive with spiritual and relational presence and entangle Indigenous ways of being against the deadening myths and erasures of settler science, government, and economy. Edward Said had said, had defined the role of the public intellectual as someone, he says, who courageously challenges and defeats both an imposed silence and normalized quiet of unseen power, wherever and whenever possible. They are dissenters, they are activists who open new spaces that welcome critical intervention. And as Said also said, they generously offer alternative narratives and other perspectives. I think Sandy fits this definition of public intellectual quite well. And so I'll stop here and welcome her to speak. We are also holding questions, by the way, till the end of the talk, so save them until then. Sandy?
Does that work? Okay. Ayanchu, Ayanmi, Inas tardes suiti sani grande. It is so lovely to be here. I'm trying to gather myself after those words. I don't really have words for the journey that brought me here, I have to say. I'm not an aging studies scholar. This is very new work to me that comes from my lived experience of caring for my mom until she passed in 2014. And, you know, I'll talk a little bit about the genesis of this book, but Dr. Katz, I have these formal thank yous and everything, and you were at the end, but I feel like I have to start with saying, you know, as I was trying to process my feelings of, you know, so many different feelings through caring for her, at one point I'm like, well, I'm a scholar. There must be stuff written on aging and whatever. And I found, not immediately, but eventually Dr. Katz's work, and it was just, took my breath away. It was like this exactly, you know, exactly. And since that time, you know, just been such a beacon for me in so many ways in finding my way through this field, through this literature. Your voice is always in my head, so it was amazing when he just reached out to me, and I was like, wait, no. And you've just been so generous ever since that time, so thank you so much. Thank you for those words. I think that it's a preface for my book, maybe. Can I ask you for that? Okay. But in any case, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I know these events don't happen I've been on both sides of these, so I know all the labor and effort that goes into them. So thank you so much to all the TCAS faculty and staff and students. Everybody's been so wonderful. To Mark, to Elizabeth, thank you so much for your words that open this. And especially a thank you to Amber, I've been doing this. This was not my first rodeo for a very long time, and I told her, but it's been so seamless and easy. I was so nervous about coming and doing this for so many reasons, but in part just because it's my first trip in 2 years or longer. But, you know, from the moment I said yes, of course, it's just been absolutely worth the journey. So before I start, a couple more caveats. This is brand new work, so I will read. Literally, I stopped writing around made myself stop writing around 3 or 4 o'clock this afternoon. It's about life and death, so a bit of a content warning. I know this is a really hard time to think, especially for some, and some of my images are a little bit stark. And so talking about death can be a bit of a vibe killer. But I also want to say, like, you know, for us to consider what it would mean to not talk about death in this moment. So I want to encourage you to kind of listen in a different register and to accept this as an offering or as a prelude, in a sense, and to hear it in the tone of promise, because that's how I think about death. And hopefully that'll be clear by the end. It's also about Indigenous elders, capital E. Thankful to the work of Jordan Lewis, also a Canadian scholar, Indigenous Canadian scholar. And so in the print, you won't see when I'm talking about E, which is Indigenous elders, and elder small e, which is sort of for more encompassing of all older adults. But I also want to recognize, because it is about death and elders, any elders that are with us tonight in this room, and to ask for your forgiveness for speaking so boldly and out of turn, as I'm not an elder. Okay, I'm just going to start. And if Amber's going to give me the 10-minute sign, and then wherever I am, I'm just going to skip to the end, so I make sure I get it completed, but we'll see how far I get. Again, hot off the press, I think, anyway. Okay, so I'll give you a bit of an overview, and then what I'm really going to present is my very rough draft of the last chapter. But I'll give you an overview so I don't just jump in at the end. In its broadest sense, oh, I forgot I have slides. Okay. I don't dismantle anything here. All right. In its broadest sense, this book is about the death of my beloved mother, Ona, a Quechua elder, and the profound impact her life, illness, and passing has had on my understanding of the world. More specifically, it presupposes that there's something to be learned about the colonial present through the study of aging in late life. I'm particularly interested in how dominant systems of care and governance encode and dispatch settler colonialist imperatives, which in turn help to produce a narrative of aging as crisis. Against these narratives, I pose a counterfactual. What if instead of crisis, we imagine global aging as a condition of possibility? What if we consider the rising tide of older adults as a portal or conceptual opening that forces a fundamental reconsideration of the central dichotomies and contradictions of a settler society built on the exigencies of capital? That is, the conflation of work with existence, of economic growth with production, of production to wage labor, and of old age with declining yield. My interest in elders and aging as an intellectual project began around 2005, when I joined the growing legion of 65.7 million family caregivers in the United States. First, my ever-stoic dad suffered a mild heart attack and stroke, which precipitated an aortic valve replacement surgery. A couple years later, he was diagnosed with stomach cancer, for which he underwent 2 surgeries, the second resulting from a surgical error committed in the first. Around the same time, my mom, already a breast cancer survivor, began to suffer a succession of chronic and acute illnesses. Eventually, her struggles with pulmonary fibrosis, glaucoma, rheumatoid arthritis, and dementia contributed to a series of falls, the last of which proved catastrophic and ultimately fatal. While my parents were never sick at the same time, their turn-taking extended the demands of intensive caregiving over the better part of a decade. The love labor was arduous. At times, I buckled under the weight. But despite the common characterization of care work as charitable and altruistic, it was never about beneficence or selflessness. On the contrary, ourselves were emboldened and amplified by the responsibility and purpose of tendering collectivity. Together, we gripped tightly, pushed back, and refused the indignities of a system not only intent on devouring the last of Ona's life, but also our existence, ultimately providing care or doing the work to make live, as well as hospicing, doing the work to let die, proved deeply meaningful, transformative, and generative. While in the aftermath of Ona's passing, I still feel the presence and company of her love and lessons, there's also an unmistakable residue of resentment. I resent how her status as elder was rendered illegible by a system where older adults are considered little more than human surplus. I resent the abject indifference, the politics of disposability, the predatory marketers, the apathy and disregard she was forced to endure in pursuit of care. And over time, I become increasingly troubled by how her desire to die with dignity was also thieved by the unrelenting undertow of crisis surrounding death in settler society. At the time, we knew that struggling against an undertow was futile. The more you fight, the more it drags you down. But when terror meets frailty meets calamity, the impulse to resist is visceral and instinctive. But we thrashed. Everyone but Ona, that is. She never did. She never relented to the predators. So this book is inspired by her indomitable spirit and prompted by the rage and love of caring in apocalyptic times. So that's from the introduction. The chapter that I'll be sharing is about elder epistemologies, and that, again, this comes, it's not exactly the end. I'm not sure if it's the end. It's the chapter that I'm working on last. But it's elder epistemologies, and the actual title, I think, is going to be For a Time Such as This, which you'll hear, it comes from a speech that Fannie Lou Hamer delivered, and I just learned today's her birthday. So I think that's a lovely sign as such. But the question here is basically, now that I've taken you through this whole journey of the text, in a sense, what are the pedagogical implications of an aging society? And I'm going to start, each chapter also has, at the beginning, like a little vignette of a story from a more personal narrative. So I'll start there. Ona was cremated. There weren't many things that she was certain about on her journey elsewhere, but creation was one of them. She said she didn't want to be enshrined in any way that obligated people to visit or tend to her place of rest. What she really meant was that she didn't want any performative grieving, especially from those who couldn't manage to visit her while she was alive. This is why she was also against having a published obituary. Ona could be petty like that. While her desires were often expressed in the tone of demand, as she aged, her bravado seemed more like a veil for her fears, for the deep-seated insecurities born from a life under colonialism. She ruminated through the questions, in a world where killing Indians and saving men still holds as tacit policy, how do we hold space for Indigenous life? When will the lives of Indigenous women matter? Did anyone really care if she lived or died? All these questions likely informed Ona's stated desire to go quietly, to disappear. The irony of this, of course, was that her entire life was lived as a struggle, if not war, against disappearance. Not in the individualist sense of demanding to be seen and heard, rather Ona's was an existential battle, a literal fight to the death and beyond for the truth of her humanity. Care and freedom are one and the same. Care and freedom are one in the same. Care and freedom are one in the same. As I ruminate on these last words from the previous chapter, their pairing feels both revelatory and insufficient, and makes me think about the aphorism, nobody's free until everybody's free. These are Fannie Lou Hamer's words. In a speech delivered at the founding of the National Women's Political Caucus in 1971, she urged a more critical solidarity among women, one that accounts for their differences across race and class, and in the interest of a less divided nation. If Fannie Lou were alive today, I wonder if she would have imagined the depth of the divisions, and if in the face of them, she would have still imagined our collective liberation to be tethered. Is it really true, for example, that the likes of Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and Bill Gates are not free because most of the rest of us are unfree? It seems more accurate to say that they are free because the vast majority of us are made unfree. While I understand the underlying existential claim that freedom experienced by the few is not real or complete as long as others remain unfree, but if these times have shown us anything, it's that the material violences of unfreedom far outweigh any perceived existential crisis among the billionaire class. In this sense, perhaps the Occupy Wall Street slogan, "We are the 99%, is more appropriate, as it marks the gross inequalities at the same time it galvanizes both class consciousness and collective resistance. It implies freedom as a praxis, a battle waged through solidarities of struggle, helping to shift the pedagogical question from the prior preoccupation with the subject of freedom, who is free, to the more urgent question of how do we get free. In this chapter, I aim to think more deeply about the pedagogy and praxis of liberatory struggles and the ways in which elders can inform them. I frame the problematic as a pedagogical question because the systems and structures of colonialism and racial capitalism themselves encode a persistent episteme. That is, the radical severings and disconnections instantiated by the hegemonic realignment of the West, mind from body, affect from reason, human from more than human. In the 16th century, function as both method and mode for unrelenting waves of epistemicide, otherwise known as the scientific revolution. This imperial realignment was serviced by a vast infrastructure of schooling that imposed, oftentimes violently, the lessons of empire. In other words, political projects are inherently pedagogical and pedagogical projects inherently political. This means that any effort to define an elsewhere of liberation must attend to the questions of knowledge production and diffusion. Stated differently, if we aim to secure more liberatory futures, we must both refuse and radically reconceive the modes of knowledge and knowledge production that gave rise to imperialist epistemes in the first place. So in addition to employing decolonial and anti-colonial thought, we must engage the broad universe of indigenous knowledges that not only refuse settler capitalist conceptions of life, death, and being, but also advance understanding of the webs of relationality that exist between and among humans, more than humans and the rest of nature. They assert relationality as a radix of care. Insofar as care and relationality do form the interstitial tissue of freedom, we need to create optimal conditions for their cultivation. We need to be attentive to how we learn to care. And in the context of the US settler state, how we generate, curate, and sustain caring relations within systems predicated upon violence. This is where elder ways of knowing and being will prove vital. Their embrace and embodiment of indeterminacy and contingency teaches us to yield rather than master, to linger rather than bypass, and to accept the truth of interdependence against the myth of rabid individualism. In so doing, they animate new questions about what it means to live the practice of freedom. My aim here is not to argue for the import of these lessons, but rather to think more deliberately about the conditions that suppress and disavow them, and those that create greater capacities for their legibility, for elders to be heard. Especially now, when the greed and animus of the extractivist class relentlessly plunders the world into irrecoverable catastrophe, there is no more critical pedagogical question for a time such as this. Before we can grapple with the concern of how to enable elders to be heard, we need to stop killing them. Since the start of the pandemic, roughly 800,000 older adults have died from COVID-19, which accounts for 80% of the total number of COVID-related deaths in the United States. That's twice the number of combat-related deaths in World War II and nearly 200,000 times more, or 200,000 more than all those who died in the 1918 flu pandemic. While the early images of besieged nursing homes and abandoned care facilities elicited national concern, the compassion didn't last long. Indeed, social indifference to the fact of older people dying became so prevalent, it impeded timely distribution of resources, and some surmised that if children had been dying in unprecedented rates, mitigation would have been swift. The implication, of course, is that old death is acceptable, inevitable, and tolerable, and in the racial calculus of age-based triaging, even rationalized as ethical. While COVID death rates provide some indication of the level of antipathy, they hint toward an even darker truth, the specter of geronticide. What they don't tell us is how many older adults died due to higher risk of disease and how many died from denied access to treatment. Why wasn't the public health response to the significantly higher mortality rates of elders a massive influx of resources, of personal protective equipment, more staff, and stricter vaccine policies? On the contrary, during the height of hospital overcrowding, some nursing homes were made to accept COVID-positive patients, and the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare waived training requirements for caregivers, as well as indefinitely suspended most nursing home inspections. Across this time, there's no question that the lives of older adults have been, at best, deprioritized and at worst, deliberately sacrificed. So why the hate? Ageism seems more like a symptom or effect than an explanatory framework, and doesn't quite capture the level of antipathy that reaches beyond the registers of a discrimination and prejudice. So is it fear? A deep dread of insignificance? If that were the case, I think we might see more of a social ennui, a zeitgeist of lamentation. But it's the loathing that feels more palpable, a kind of disgust and repulsion that I imagine was once reserved for lepers in medieval times. They too were stigmatized, removed, warehoused, and condemned, although at the time such treatment was less about the science of contagion than it was their status as less than human, as pollutants, pariahs, walking corpses, and the living dead. Interestingly, when leprosy reemerged in the 19th century, it was deployed as a means of making Europe modern, whereby the disease was reframed as an ailment of the primitive and the tropics, and as a threat to civilization. In other words, epidemics have always been a tool of empire. At issue then is not just a question of emotions, the felt experience, or even the moral zeitgeist, but one of political economy. Affect theorists would argue that this is precisely their work, the study and analysis of the historical present through the structures and attachment, through the structures of attachment and feeling. Lauren Berlant's signature text, Cruel Optimism, is a meditation on our attachment to dreams we know are destined to be dashed. She imagines the American dream and the cycles of optimism and disappointment animated by its central promise as an exemplar of cruel optimism, or what she describes as the condition that arises when the thing you desire prevents you from flourishing. Sadly, she lived long enough to witness the spectacular level of pent-up rage unleashed by the waves of fantasy and futility that in the past couple of years have been cascading over America's acolytes with the sustained force of a tsunami, surfacing the inner debris of a once thought of paradise. In the early days of the shutdown, we all watched in horror as spectacularized images of rabid anti-maskers and anti-vaxxers were juxtaposed with those of frontline workers in hazmat suits, loading pile-hide corpses into mobile morgues. Just as the gravity of this dissonance began to sink in, we were hit with everything from a stock market crash, bushfires, to desert locusts and murder hornets. All of it felt apocalyptic. Then came January 6, 2021. That's a day when armed Trump loyalists stormed the US Capitol in a cathartic exercising of fomented rage. After 4 years or 5 centuries of demagoguery and fear-mongering about a stolen election, the eruption was highly predictable. Nevertheless, initial reports of the insurrection surfaced in the familiar refrains of shock and awe. Flummoxed citizens and journalists appeared ashen as they repeated the all-too-common refrain, "This is not who we are. This is not America." Apparently, dreams die hard, particularly when fueled by the vast super and infrastructures of the hegemonic settler state. While the cruelties of optimism may have been on full display on that infamous day, I don't know if the affective turn can fully account for the level of vitriol and sheer disregard for life. What gets glossed over in Berlant's theory is the genocidal origin of dashed dreams and its continued propagation through the ongoing structures of disavowal and disabandonment, particularly for Indigenous peoples and elders. The American dream is wholly predicated upon, presumes our absence, our nullius, our nullification. To account for this, Paiute scholar Kristen Simmons proposes the notion of settler atmospherics that imagines colonialism as a surround, as the air we breathe, and the collective but unequally distributed conditions in which we live. She defines settler air more specifically as an asphyxiating imbrication of the regimes of foundational violence, racism, US militarism, industrialism, and capitalism. Sometimes, like at Standing Rock, that air is further weaponized, made into munitions of terror, atmospheric weapons that in turn create atmospheres of apprehension. Consider that, at last count, there are 532 Superfund sites on tribal lands that stand as monuments to the longue durée of US empire and the production of Indians as both crisis and colonial residue. In these atmospherics, Indians are made into excess, the ghostly traces that must be pushed aside. Or in the words of Jody Bird, the site of already doneness that begins to linger on as unwelcome guests to the future. Older adults are similarly cast as unwelcome guests in the way of settler dreaming. Their constitutive refusal of the dream/nightmare of expansion points to their own already doneness. To the settler futures, elders, like Indians, can only be lepers or contagions. Their unproductive and sometimes inert bodies are similarly made into excess, are perceived as excessive, because death and finitude are anathema to a society built on expansion and racial capitalism. We see this in everything from the multi-billion-dollar anti-aging business to the rising obsession with artificial intelligence and virtual reality. The central desire is always for new frontiers, for more accumulation, more bodies, more land, more life. Perhaps at no time in modern history has a greater cross-section of humanity been witness to the foundational violences and extractions of the settler surround. Whether whether from the unrelenting waves of shock from climate disaster, the significant uptick in mass shootings, the anti-queer and trans legislation, the overturning of Roe, or the weight of over 1 million largely preventable deaths from COVID-19. America seems to be little more than a deathscape, with more and more bodies sacrificed at the altar of capitalism. This coupled with intensifying interest in developing a new space economy, the emergence of the billionaire space barons, the militarized space force, irradiate the persistence of the colonialist fantasy about multiplanetary conquest and settler immortality. For settler dreamers, there is no life without conquest. So whether we're at the apex of cruel optimism or nadir of settler atmospherics, the most pressing question, again, what's the antidote? I argue that the antidote partly lies in unthinking the episteme of settler hegemony, the myths about supreme and infinite life, and rethinking the horizon of decolonial and anti-colonial thought. Unthinking requires some consideration of how it all began. What were the legitimating apparatuses that got us here in the first place? We know that in the 17th century, allegiances to white Protestant nationalism, settler colonialism, and patriarchy were cultivated through texts like the New England Primer, McGuffey Readers, and reinforced through pedagogical methods like the Federal Catechism and Lancasterian system, and further codified in policies that denied girls, poor, and/or non-white children access to schooling. Then came the period of aggressive assimilationism and segregation. In 1819, Congress passed the Civilization Act, which funded and authorized benevolent societies, read religious missionaries, to establish schools for Native children as a means of stimulating, quote, the civilization process. In 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson became the separate but equal law of the land, relegating Black children to nearly a century of inadequate schooling. Both policies continue to shape the conditions and structures of education for Black and Native children. In 2022, we see a recommitment to the appropriation of schooling as an extension of the settler apparatus. At the time of this writing, 36 states have adopted or introduced laws that restrict the teaching of race, American history, politics, sexual orientation, and gender identity. The underlying claim is that such curricula, quote, ignore the magnificent history of the United States of America in becoming the beacon of freedom for the entire world, and are, quote, designed to indoctrinate our children, programming them to be ashamed of and divided by race and or ethnicity. That's a quote from a policy in North Carolina. The unfounded and ahistorical allegations of indoctrination hit Indigenous peoples extra hard, because if there was ever a time in history when the brutalities of indoctrination were exacted upon a captive population of school children, it was during the centuries-long project of Indian boarding schools. Through this federally funded program, Native students across North America were wrenched from their families and subjected to physical, sexual, psychological abuse at the hands of missionaries, lay teachers, priests, and nuns. The recent discovery of thousands of unmarked graves and human remains in the US and Canada provides some insight to just how many Indigenous children suffered the cruelties. In her article, Death by Civilization, Ojibwe journalist Mary Annette Pember writes about this history through the lens of her mother's experience at the St. Mary's Catholic Indian boarding school. The first line of the article reads, "My mother died while surviving civilization." The rising death toll of the modern civilizing project has led many to disasterize this historical juncture. Is it neo-fascism, white ethno-nationalism, a Proud Boys death cult, or even as the end of democracy? But to me, it feels more like the death throes of settler hegemony. I didn't know that the death throes were real until I hospiced Ona. When the balance of one's time is spent in and out of hospitals, nursing homes, and palliative care centers, you see a lot of death. And contrary to Hollywood depictions, few go peacefully. Rather, the process of death is often protracted, and in the confines of Western biomedicine, bodies are paced through a gauntlet of emergency room visits, death-defying interventions, and life-extending technologies. Under this model of bureaucratic care, some are permitted to transition quietly, but most of the time, death is treated like the enemy, an end or even failure of the Promise Project. Within this context, bodies generally agitate and resist. Sometimes there's a period of terminal lucidity or what is commonly perceived as an end-of-life rally, but eventually persons fall into a state of increased agitation, confusion, and general disquiet. And as the end draws near, there's often an episode of particularly distressing delirium that comes along with multiple organ failure. They look as if they're fighting their last war on earth and losing. These are the death throes. My recollections of these moments make me rethink the events of January 6th. Maybe what we witnessed on that day was the beginning of the end, the last gasp of a dying regime, a day when multiple organs of the settler order failed, or more accurately, self-destructed in a cannibalistic melee of white nationalism. To be clear, I'm not suggesting or wishing upon the world an end of democracy or of the United States, but rather that we may be upon the protracted demise of the hegemonic myth of America. I also want to suggest that this need not be a tragedy. On the contrary, if the nation is to ever survive, is ever to realize its stated aim to be an actual democracy, perhaps the death of America is necessary. While even the prospect of this may seem treasonous, Berlant's work suggests it's actually our ongoing denial that forestalls future flourishing. James Baldwin similarly understood the significance of death to processes of renewal and to the American project in particular. On this point, he's worth quoting at length. He writes in The Fire Next Time, "It seems to me that one ought to rejoice in the fact of death, ought to decide indeed to earn one's death by confronting with passion and conundrum of life. But white Americans don't believe in death, and this is why the darkness of my skin so intimidates them, and this is also why the presence of the Negro in this country can bring about its destruction. It's the responsibility of free men to trust and to celebrate what is constant. Birth, struggle, and death are constant, and so is love, though we may not always think so. And to apprehend the nature of change, to be able and willing to change. I speak of change not on the surface, but in the depths, change in the sense of renewal. But renewal becomes impossible if one supposes things to be constant that are not, safety, for example, money or power. One clings then to chimeras, by which one can only be betrayed, and the entire hope, the entire possibility of freedom disappears. And by destruction, I mean precisely the abdication by Americans of any effort to really be free." If Baldwin sensed that the quintessential failure of white Americans to rejoice in the fact of death is what forestalls us, then how do we better enable letting die? Here I think about the multiple rituals of death we perform with the passing of a loved one, and whether we need opposite rituals for the death of an idea. If indeed the idea of America has reached the end of its life, how do we let it die? Do we hold a memorial service, a wake, a funeral? Who delivers the eulogy? Do we look the other way and let it die a slow and painful death? Do we orchestrate a mercy killing or jump it with defibrillation paddles, bringing it back to life but in a more thoughtful repose? Or maybe we take it out back and slay it gangster style. Whatever the case, prolonging the death of a dead idea does just as much damage as other protracted deaths. It breeds unresolved grief, false hope, and unrequited rage. So whatever else we do, we need to make a collective promise, a blood oath, to let it die. Because in the words of Arundhati Roy, we cannot continue trying to stitch our future to a past in a manner that refuses to acknowledge the ruptures of this time. In her now iconic essay, "The Pandemic is a Portal," she urges, quote, "In the midst of this terrible despair, the rupture offers us a chance to rethink the doomsday machine we have built for ourselves. The pandemic provided a portal, a gateway between one world and the next, and we can either choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice, our hatred, our avarice, our databanks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us, or we can walk through lightly, with little baggage, ready to imagine another world." For Americans, imagining the state of beyond settler hegemony is so unimaginable that many have turned to fantastical discourses as a means of metabolizing the grief and anger, as a way of making live. In the US, for example, the genre of horror fiction is currently flourishing. Jeffrey Weinstock, author of The American Ghost Story, explains the ebbs and flows of the genre as an effect of the ever-shifting landscape of historically conditioned anxieties, injustices, and desires that are typically reflected in any society's ghost stories. In standard American horror, the haunted lives, schools, and experiences of the terminally haunted grounds of settlement are depicted. Indeed, writes Nazowitz, the trope of the Indian burial ground is so common in American horror that it's often presumed as a subtext for films, for horror and ghost stories, even when it isn't. The genre of the ghost story is also favored among Native storytellers, although they engage the practice more as a mode of survivance and subversion. Denise Lowe contends that the oral literature of residential school ghost stories allow the painful experiences to remain alive in memory, despite their omission or elision in official history books. Black and Indigenous literary and political theorists have also turned to the discourses of haunting as a means of working through and past the traumas of settler possession and dispossession, the metaphysics of already doneness. Gordon in particular links her work on haunting and ghostly matters to the praxis of unforgetting and remembering the abusive systems and structures of violence that forces of power always try to obfuscate. She writes, quote, "Indeed, it seemed to me that haunting was precisely the domain of turmoil and trouble, that moment when things are not in their assigned places, when the cracks in the rigging are exposed, when the people who are meant to be invisible show up without any sign of leaving, when disturbed feelings won't go away, when something else or something different from before feels like it must be done and prompts a something to be done. That's to say that futurity is imbricated or interwoven into the very scene of haunting," close quote. By linking the trope and analytic of haunting to futurity, Gordon effectively distinguishes it from trauma, providing a means of supplanting the already doneness of Indians to the more agentic space of something to be done. Even so, I wonder about the dilatory effect of relegating what is real, histories and peoples, to the realm of the unreal, to the immaterial. Indigenous peoples are not spectrality. Ancestors are not ghosts. We are humans and beings of the past, present, and future. The discourses of haunting belie the more complex cosmologies of Indigenous peoples. So to make live, we need to unsettle settler conceptions about life and death and reclaim them as spaces of being that are not simply interconnected, but deeply constitutive. In Quechua, for example, we have a concept of chekchi, that expresses the state and dialectics of tension and antagonism as both necessary and ontological. In other words, there's no life without death, no joy without sadness, no love without indifference, and no creation without destruction. Time is neither linear, moving from past to future, nor unidirectional, but rather multidirectional and cyclical. In the Aymara language, for example, the past is ahead and the future is behind. And in Quechua, the same word can be used for both. Nyaupapacha. The shared understanding is that there's no history of progress outside the orders of relationality or in the succinct and powerful words of Kim Tallbear, life is death is life. Thus, to relegate Indigenous life to the discourses of haunting, to ghost us, is in and of itself a practice of epistemicide. So while I appreciate the intended refusals in the discourses of haunting, of time, of metaphysics, of colonizer peace, as well as the move to reclaim the spectral as a space of power, Indigenous futures don't belong to a fantastical other world. They are elsewhere. For a more effective antidote, I turn to Vanessa Andreotti's work on hospicing. In her book, Hospicing Modernity, she defines modernity as a story that's no longer tenable and offers a virtual guidebook on how to disinvest from its harmful habits of being. She recognizes that for some, the process will be painful, sad, and traumatic. She recognizes that the process in 2014, I hospiced my mom, so I have some sense of the process. It's indeed its own kind of reckoning, a place of mercy one enters after recognizing that the lived life is no longer sustainable and ready to acknowledge the state of decline. Andreotti and her colleagues write on this hospicing process more fully. She writes, quote, "Hospicing entails sitting with the system in decline, learning from its history, offering palliative care, seeing oneself in that which is dying, attending to the integrity of the process, dealing with tantrums, incontinence, anger, and hopelessness, cleaning up and clearing the space for something new. This is unlikely to be a glamorous process. It will entail many frustrations, an uncertain timeline, and unforeseeable outcomes without guarantees. Hospicing demands a critique that's self-implicated rather than heroic, vanguardist, or innocent. It demands a kind of courage that is unneurotic, not invested in self-affirmation, a kind of courage that helps us to look the bull in the eye, to recognize ourselves in the bull, and to see the bull as a teacher, precisely when it's trying to kill us. Courage in the face of death, by which I mean life, is integral to elder teachings. I don't mean the kind of reckless courage we see in the movies. I mean the kind that's almost indistinguishable from fear, that comes from a deep sense of awareness and humility about the smallest of human life. Consider that the Black Hills are 1.8 billion years old. The Pacific Ocean is 200 years old, 200 million years old. Lake Titicaca is 3 million years old, and the giant redwoods of California lived to a mere 2,000 years. As elders move closer to, in, and through the elsewhere, they gain more access to this vast web of relations, sharing a mode of existence and episteme that constitutes the greater universe of elder knowing. Here I intentionally use the verb knowing rather than the noun knowledge to underscore that knowing is a praxis, a collective effort, and a practice of learning to live together in radical contingency. Life and death are processes, not destinations. In a time-space governed by relationality and outside of the logics of extraction, the terms of engagement shift. Namely, progress ceases to be the aim and is replaced by the practices of living and dying well. In Quechua, this is the notion of sumak cauce, which often gets mistranslated into the good life, or in Spanish, buen vivir. But because both sumak and causai have multiple meanings, the compound is also much more than living well. Sumak cauce encompasses a way of being, a political project, a portal, a planetary elsewhere of possibility. I come to a resting point, thinking about how or whether such ideas could circulate in more formal pedagogical spaces. The daily habits and practices of school are deeply individualistic, centered around the cultivation of individual dreams, desires, and achievements. Even at its more radical iterations, it tends to focus on human rights, voices, and agency. I don't know how to organize a school where learning happens in quiet and interstitial spaces, outside of any one's gaze, metric, measurement, or even analysis, or how to design a place of learning that doesn't disavow, that invites and embraces pain, failure, limits, and incompleteness. If we were ever to build such a school, elders and older adults would be at the center. By virtue of their very beings, elders enact praxis of interdependency, deliberation, and slowness in ways that deeply challenge and outright refuse settler capitalist logics of independent, impulsive, and fast. So if we're ever so honored and lucky to be called to walk, to learn beside them, we need to get ready. We must be ready and willing to serve as envoys, as death doulas, palliative care workers, and courageous warriors, because the future is behind us.